And we're live. It is Monday, August 9th, 5:02 p.m. Eastern Time. I am sitting in a new location that, as Ben has pointed out, has dots on the background akin to a kindergarten, but I'm not in a kindergarten. And we are not allowed to have fun anymore, but we are allowed to have John Q. Barrett back to talk with us this time about eviction moratoriums and the constitutionality and all of the questions that are kind of everything that's been going on with them. So welcome back to the show, John. It's so nice to see you.
Thanks, Kate, and Ben and Genevieve. Great to be with all of you.
So, key question to start. John, do you know Genevieve?
I do know Genevieve. Genevieve has been my student, and she was my student in the horrible spring semester of 2020.
Same as me.
And she's fantastic, and I got to know her briefly in person, and then she became a box on a screen, and I'm glad that she's, flourishing.
I got to know her first as a box on a screen and was surprised to find that she actually does exist in 3 dimensions.
Yes.
But as I'm sure Kate has told you, Genevieve is the member of the audience who has been promoted to co-host, so this is a big St. John's episode. I am outnumbered 3-1.
I guess it is. Well, in a sense, as a student, she's in the audience in a classroom, and she quickly promoted herself to something above that in the short in-person time when I got to know her.
You guys are very kind.
So this is
No. It was like we'd be sitting in class, and I'd say something like, well, this is like the law on all of this, and then there would be like this hand raised in the back of the class, and I'd be like, yes, Genevieve, and she'd say something like, but if that's the way that the law works, then doesn't that conflict with our I don't know, it was like some like very like the next triple level of like where everyone was in 1L when they're taking property class, and it was excellent. And so that semester I didn't like do grades. I went through. Do you remember this, John? We didn't, because it wasn't graded.
We went remote, and then we were going to have grades, and then we reconsidered, and we ended up with pass-fail.
And then we were not allowed to shadow grade at all.
And
so
we were not allowed to shadow grade
myself. And
we were allowed to lightly, constructively feedback.
Yes. Yeah. It was really hard. So it was just kind of like, yeah.
It was probably better that we didn't have grades that semester, to be completely honest. But I did enjoy it thoroughly. And once that kind of got removed, it kind of gave a couple of other people a little bit more freedom to think about things slightly more abstractly. So there was like a pro and a con.
Well, yeah. I really did grade all those exams, because I wanted to make sure that nobody on page 5 in the middle of the page had, done a George Carlin routine and then was going to out me for not having detected it. So
that's true. That's
unfair. Who would do that? Actually, someone in law school would do that. Actually, like someone would out you. Not the George Carlin thing. That seems totally believable. But like screw themselves out of principle. But anyways, so Genevieve, why don't we kind of get started? What did you? I was interested that you had asked John to come on and talk about this, but tell us what you wrote him in the email.
Oh, well, I was just so fascinated with all the information and the articles that were coming out about Speaker Pelosi and President Biden and all the discussion about extending the eviction moratorias. And since, just a quick update for the audience, that had elapsed on July 31st, there was a lot of pressure, particularly because the court had only let the eviction moratoria elapse on its own by a very slim margin. Actually, Justice Kavanaugh was the concurring opinion that was about a paragraph long, where he basically said, in principle, I agree with those who would appeal the stay, or I apologize if that's not the correct term, vacate the stay. However, since there's practicalities and like public health issues now, and it would give time for things to be, especially the funding the federal government has provided, to be distributed in a much more organized fashion, we're just going to let things go. So he kind of did a compromise, which was surprising from someone just very little knowledge just reading it. And then you had all these discussions later, because as you know, the Delta variant is a whole different world that we're dealing with. Infection rates are rising. And it basically came down to the hot potato of who gets to try and continue the eviction moratoria.
Yeah, I think that's a great summary. There's sort of been a series of moratoria at the federal level. There have been some state moratoria too, but President Trump in the initial CARES Act was actually the father of the eviction moratorium, so we shouldn't forget that. And then there was a second law that legislated it. And then kind of along the way, there have been CDC policy announcements that have extended it. And by this springtime, there was a CDC order in effect that was due to expire in, I think, at the end of June. And it was in that time period when the Alabama Realtors Association, and I hope somebody can shed some light on what their real concerns and suffering is about. But they go to court in DC and they seek a declaratory judgment, basically, that this CDC moratorium is illegal. And they win in the trial court. Judge Friedrich says there is not statutory authority for the CDC to promulgate this moratorium. But she stays her order. The realtors go to the DC Circuit to a motions panel and ask for that stay to be lifted, not to wait for the appeal. But they lose. So a motions panel continues the stay. And then that goes on an emergency basis to the Supreme Court. And the realtors again lose 5-4, with Kavanaugh being the fifth vote, because even though the June 30th moratorium had in the interim been extended to July 30th, it was the end of June by that point, and there were about 30 days. And I think there were multiple timelines going on. I think COVID was at that point declining. We were coming out of it. The world was rosy. And the money that had been appropriated in the Biden relief law to bail out, in effect, the tenants and the landlords was enacted, appropriated, was due to flow through the pipeline. So, kind of in that mix of there's not much time left, this is a fluid situation, there are appropriated funds coming, Justice Kavanaugh kind of holds his nose and says, I will vote with the liberals, if you will, Chief Justice Roberts and the three more liberals, not to vacate Judge Friedrich's stay, which is the DC Circuit's bigger stay. And if there's anything more coming, we're going to need a new law. If you're going to reenact this another time nationwide, we need a new law.
Can I ask just a quick
jump
clarifying?
in. I'm rambling.
No. You're not rambling at all. But I just wanted to, for everyone's kind of sake, and even for my own, explain the CDC moratorium as law versus as guidance. I think what we're used to hearing for a lot of COVID is CDC guidance that that then turns into law at the state level or at the federal level in some capacity, through enactment. But the moratorium is it guidance or is it
this is actual regulatory policy making. It's pursuant to a statute from 1944. It's a World War II era statute, Public Health Service Act, Section 361, which at that point authorized the Surgeon General, with the approval of the Secretary, and through later amendments, it's been put under HHS and reconfigured in effect to mean CDC, can promulgate and enforce rules to prevent transmission of communicable diseases. And it's pretty broad language, although there's an interpretation issue, and that's what Judge Friedrich's trial court decision is based on. But that authority is the CDC's sort of blank check to protect us from communicable diseases. It's quarantine order authority. It's product embargo authority. At the border, at Ellis Island, in the hull of a ship. It's detaining people coming into the country if they might be carriers of communicable diseases. And then the kind of broad phrase is, whatever is necessary to prevent. And that's the phrase that the CDC uses to say, if people get evicted during the time of COVID, they might be carriers, they now become homeless, or they move in with their relatives. That will cause transmission. This is a public health issue. So we're going to freeze eviction and keep them in their own spaces, in effect, socially distanced. So this is not a mask recommendation. This is, in effect, a regulation, a
so
rule.
Can I ask a question about this? Because, first of all, the chain of logic to CDC authority here seems pretty attenuated. So this is not, people. This is basically homeless people are more likely to spread the virus than people in their houses, in their apartments. And so if you evict people, you are more likely to create more community spread. Therefore, we're invoking public health authorities essentially to regulate the housing market, which is, of course, not what any of this is really about. Cori Bush was not camped out on the floor, on the steps of the Capitol to prevent COVID spread. Her concern is, that people in this environment should not be evicted from their homes. And so I guess my first question is, are we using a kind of square peg for a round hole here? And if the concern is not creating more homelessness out of the COVID crisis because people can't work and people can't, et cetera, so we should have, don't pretend this is about COVID control. This is about using public health authorities to effectuate, non-public health objectives that may have public health implications.
You're saying it's really an economic justice housing policy directive rather than a public health directive. And it certainly got some of that. Although, frankly, I think, remember the actor. The CDC is not looking to solve the nation's housing problem. We're kind of taking that on casually. I think there's a sort of sincere motivation in the actor to stay in their lane, which is public health. And it's also not just homelessness that we're talking about. It's, the renters of the world are not all going to end up under a bridge or in a tent. They're going to move in with brothers and sisters and parents and so forth if they lose their own apartments. And so that becomes crowded living, and that does become the transmission risk. So I think it's a mixed bag. I think your point is real, but it's not, this is not 100% pretext. And I would guess it's more genuine than pretext.
And similarly, when I look at I look at, it seems to me in an era of vaccine, if the concern is public health, there are probably more targeted ways to do this than a moratorium on eviction, i.e., for example, you can't evict somebody without giving the CDC 10 days notice so that they can swarm in and offer that person and their family whatever vaccines they might need. Isn't this a bit of a 2020 solution in 2021?
It could be. It's a resource question and a planning question and an administration ability question, but you could certainly tailor something that was much more limited and public health efficient, I think. I'm not a public health expert. But I think, cutting CDC a little bit of credit here, the change from the regulation that expired, the one that Kavanaugh declined to kill, which expired at the end of July. And the new one is at least a little bit of a move in that direction, because the new one is limited. It's not a nationwide moratorium anymore. It's limited to high or substantial transmission areas. Now, admittedly, by CDC, that includes 80% of the country, but it's not coast to coast 100%. It's those glowing red states rather than the orange states on the COVID maps.
And I believe there's also a condition that says that if infection rates improve, meaning that they decrease over 14 days, the moratorium ceases to apply.
Yes, yeah, that's correct too. And it's also a 60-day new moratorium. It's August 3 to October 3. So it's, sort of during this Delta and its playing out period that we're now in, which could, be a very bad season, or could again be something that ends with a hopeful uptick.
Do we think that it's tailored enough, though? Because it just seems like the interplay of all the different branches here really not wanting to be the ones ethically, morally, or legally responsible for evicting people.
Right. Well, I think there are two questions there. Is it tailored enough to comply with the statute, which is this big, broad statute that says, CDC has the authority to issue such regulations as in its judgment are necessary to prevent the communicable disease, and then the interpretation issues within that. And I guess kind of in the background is the constitutional question about whether this is some kind of unconstitutional standardless delegation from the Congress, from the statute back in 1944 to, in effect, CDC of today. And CDC becomes the lawmaker without really any guidance or any limitation, which is, what the non-delegation doctrine, at least theoretically, says is a separation of powers problem, and a court could strike down. We haven't seen that since 1935, but that's part of what the realtors have raised in the district court. That's part of what Judge Friedrich didn't reach because she decided it on the statutory ground. But there are other cases percolating around, and that constitutional question is in the background.
But didn't the Supreme Court kind of answer that constitutional question in American Trucking Association? I mean, it seems like they had a real opportunity at that point to revisit the non-delegation doctrine. The D.C. Circuit, my good friend Stephen Williams, may he rest in peace,
right,
gave them, served them up a chance to do it. And they said 9-0, kind of, we give up on this.
I think since then it got closer. In the Gundy case, which was DOJ making regulations for handling convicted sex offenders, the court was a short bench. Kavanaugh missed the oral argument, so it was an 8-justice decision in 2018 or early 2019. But it was 5-3 to find no non-delegation problem. But Alito supplied the fifth vote, and his opinion really makes very clear that he's holding his nose, that he thinks there is a non-delegation doctrine. I think really the context of sex offenders makes a difference to Justice Alito, who's a law enforcement prosecutor guy. And in some other context, there might now be 5 votes to revive a non-delegation doctrine. So I think, Judge Williams, rest in peace, might be smiling about the trend line.
So what is the statutory argument? Daphne Friedrich is somebody I take pretty seriously. I know I'm not supposed to say that about Trump-appointed judges, but I think she's very smart and interesting. What's the argument for there not being statutory authority on the part of the CDC to do this?
Well, it's complicated and it's textual. The codification of this provision is 42 USC section 264 for anybody who wants to track it down. And the interrelationship of the two clauses suggests a closed universe of authority here that is limited to products and animals, and not events like housing and eviction. That's how she reads the statute. and she draws on a couple of statutory canons of construction to do that, and basically says this law is not the omnibus, any regulation you think makes the world healthier that CDC thinks it is. This is actually tailored to specific things, animals, products, and human beings entering from outside of the United States. And this isn't in any of those categories.
So sorry also, I realize that this room is very echoey, but I'm really interested in leaving aside everything that we've kind of just discussed about like the non-delegation doctrine and where this power is coming from. Let's just assume that is going to stand legally. The end of the day, this means that evictions cease. Town justices don't or whoever, local judges are not issuing eviction notices to people. They're not being enforced by sheriffs. There's no self-help evictions that are happening. All of these things completely forbidden. People are staying in their apartments, in their houses. They're not paying rent. If they aren't paying, they're not paying rent. There have been a number of stories of people who are trying to who have been supposedly, I don't know how much I believe these, but supposedly taking advantage of this. I guess there was a story recently in the Hamptons of somebody staying in a $30,000 a week house with a bunch of people and deciding that they were not going to leave. And saying that you can't evict us because
Probably
there's an eviction moratorium. That actually sounds mildly believable.
Group House of Manhattan social scum, right?
Yes, right.
I think this is all of our future.
Yeah.
We pay the security deposit on an outrageously fancy apartment, move in, and refuse to leave. I think this is such a brilliant idea.
This is the dirty little secret of housing, which is that it is a very messy business. It's not that's not that big a secret, but when you really get down to it, it is a very gnarly human interaction when it goes bad. And I don't know how this is all going to end up. I'm sure that there are good faith tenants who are being protected by this order, without a doubt. I would actually say that's probably most of them. I'm sure there are people who are free riding on this order and
but most tenants are real people living in real and modest apartments, and it's just housing.
Right, exactly. And so but at the end of the day, if someone hasn't been paying their rent for whether or not it's good faith or bad faith, and they just stop paying their rent and they're spending all their money, and there's some type of order for $60,000 issued by a judge for back pay of rent, is that going to be are we, you said before, let's talk about the money and where the money is coming from the federal government and how we get it from one place to the other, and when it's going to be, legally speaking, when you sue the individual as the landlord, for which I assume you have to do first, and then when you can take that failure to if there has to be a declaration of bankruptcy from the individual that also has to go along in order to qualify for the financial aid. I mean, we're talking months and months and months of paperwork and filing and hearings for people to get paid, for people to get out of the apartment, for new people to move in. If that even happens at all, if there's not some type of kind of layover that we decide to so that's what I'm kind of wondering.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And let me grab the opportunity here to mention Andrew Cuomo, in case he wasn't otherwise going to come up, because I learned in the New York Post today that New York State's
Didn't his father go to St. John's?
Pardon me?
Didn't his father go to St. John's Law School?
His father, the illustrious governor of New York, did go to St. John's, but he did not.
Yes.
So we'll leave it at that.
Yes.
But New York State's share of the appropriated funds for rent relief to basically fill the gap is an enormous pot of money that is barely being tapped because the state is incompetent in setting up the bureaucracy and making the application forms accessible and so forth. And I think that's typical of almost every state. I think there may have been a Washington, D.C. naivete that we did PPP appropriation and distribution relatively effectively in 2020, and that this rent money in 2021 would be a similar kind of thing, a big pot of cash, and it would get farmed out through the states, and it would go through the landlord, through the tenants to the landlords, and satisfy the arrears, and in effect eliminate this problem. But the money's still way up in the pipeline.
So,
and that's
to put a
become
fine
clear in this last month too.
to put a fine point on Kate's question, is this good policy? I mean, at the end of the day, if you're like, you know, people do own properties and they rent them out, and they do have a reasonable expectation of getting paid for renting them out. And if you make it impossible for them to evict people who over a long period of time aren't paying their rent, you do actually create a dysfunctional rental market.
Right.
And so I mean, I know it's a heartless question, but what are the circumstances in which we wouldn't renew a moratorium on evictions?
I think
Kate, you're the property professor. So
I mean, I've thought about this a lot, because this is like the market side of this more than the legal, not like constitutional side of this, is just super interesting to me as a property person. Because if you wanted to socialize and standardize socialization of property, this is just the most broken, winged way to do it, I guess, is like you're just like, what you're doing is basically you're creating both good faith and bad faith people who are relieving themselves of this program. You're creating no barrier for entry. Anyone who just doesn't want to pay their rent could like theoretically just stop paying their rent and like take advantage of this until it's sorted out at the end of the day, which, as I said, could be months and months and months from now. It's an incredibly third rail type of political way to do this, to create, because as you said, it's heartless to all of a sudden put all of these people out in the street and put them in, make them at risk for disease, or just put them out in the street. But this is how we run housing in the United States of America, which is that we treat it like a market, because that's what we do with property, generally speaking. And we believe that people should be compensated and all should work out in a perfect capitalist system. What we know in fact is that, of course, this doesn't always work out, and we've had homeless problems that are plagued the United States for years, especially in places where there is a huge constriction on supply of new housing that is affordable, like in San Francisco or in LA and Austin, and places where tech tends to blow up and people have lots of cash that they can go and buy lush homes and prevent new housing development. But my point is just that basically, I think that the politics are against this being lifted in any type of timely way. It's as you saw, the New York Times headlines. I don't know if you saw this, John. The New York Times wrote a bunch of headlines that are Biden staff scrambling behind scenes to basically put the moratorium back in place because they did not want the grotesqueness of a mass housing eviction on the first year of the president. And
right.
I think that's
remember Herbert Hoover, baby.
Yes,
you don't want this named after your presidency.
Exactly. Oh my gosh, that's such a great point. The shanty towns and the Hoovervilles and yeah. I mean, so this is just this. I think that the politics are terrible. But at the end of the day is what I do think that maybe we can take out of this is that if we want to socialize housing, which I frankly think would not be the worst possible idea, to create a bigger kind of floor for affordable housing and more affordable housing generally. I'm very pro affordable housing. You just start doing it and you start making it better. And maybe we take a bunch of in New York, for example, we take a bunch of the commercial space. Then we seize it with eminent domain. We pay them a lot of money for commercial space, and then we turn it into government affordable housing projects that are in places that used to have Gucci or or whatever in their storefronts. But this is not out of the realm of possibility, and it's a much better. I think it would be a much better argument for economic use than a Gucci. So,
So
yeah.
I'm puzzled about the demand side. Obviously, in hot tech economy locations and so forth, there is lots of demand and money. But the realtors of Alabama, the plaintiffs in this case in Judge Friedrich's court, have 3 tenants. That's their standing. That's their injury, who are in arrears, who aren't paying their rent. They're in the apartments. There's no representation about anything special about them. So let's assume we're talking just a random place in Alabama. Are there new paying tenants ready to get in if the existing tenants can be evicted?
It really depends. Some of the numbers that I've seen, and I was just trying to look up the study and I can't find it, but some of the numbers that I'm seeing is that basically there's a huge exodus for a lot of people have gone back to live with their parents that are ages 20 to like 35, even to 40. Okay. They want they want 2-bedroom apartments if they're going to move anywhere. So there is kind of like, you're finding young people who are having their first ever apartments, and there are no 1-bedroom or studio apartments, because all of the people who want 1-bedrooms or are living in 1-bedroom or studio apartments cannot move into 2-bedroom apartments, because a lot of the family-sized eviction moratoriums are like in areas where they're like it's like two bedrooms or more. So basically, as Ben said, like, there is this incredible downstream effect when you start fucking with the housing market, that just kind of like, that there's like the restriction of this one area, like, has all of these downstream effects for every type of renter of every stripe, because there's just no movement. And that's kind of what any market relies on, right? So, I mean, I think it's kind of fascinating in a dark way. If it was like, I just don't know how we're going to get out of this. I don't think Biden, unless he makes uses it an excuse to make some huge overhaul to housing systems generally. What do you think, Genevieve?
I mean, what I keep fixating on is like the more normative part of this from the executive branch itself, because I mean, when we consider the legislature as our rulemaking and statutory body, you still have this tolerance for an increased executive in this period, which I do find really interesting, because if this had happened last year or the year before, I think that there would be alarms everywhere. And I don't know that they're wrong not to have alarms now, because when you consider how the 3 branches are laid out, you do have like specific checks and balances. And there was a lot of fear for President Trump ignoring particular Supreme Court orders. That is not what has happened here, nor am I saying that that's what President Biden has done. But when you get like up to the line at the urging of the Speaker of the House because of intractability within the legislature, you're creating a system now that rewards almost bad behavior on the part of some branches. And do we want to do that? And I keep thinking, like, how can we even have the space for this discussion, because the immediate needs of so many people are really at risk? So I don't really have a question there.
I think the courts are going to be heard from. I mean, are being heard from and will continue to be heard from. I don't think we're going to get a new big national housing law, not from this Congress, not in this short term. But the Biden administration in this COVID context is, through the CDC, doing what it can to prevent evictions. And the real estate interests are litigating. And, on the last developments back in Judge Friedrich's court, the real estate attorneys, Jones Day representing the Alabama real estate attorneys, have moved that she enforce her previous decision on the prior moratorium as if it's against this current moratorium, lift the stay, make this stop. And DOJ basically, I think correctly, is going to win, saying we've got this panel opinion, which stayed everything. That's the law of the case in the D.C. Circuit.
And which the Supreme Court did not overturn.
The Supreme Court did not overturn.
And by the way, the order that she enjoined does not exist anymore. And you don't get to litigate on the basis of something that has been superseded by something else.
Yeah.
See the travel ban cases.
Exactly. But there will be new challenges that pop up. This one may be moot, but then a refiling of a new challenge. And there's a Sixth Circuit case, and I think there's a Fifth Circuit case and an 11th Circuit case. And these are going to converge on the merits, maybe not this term, but eventually at the Supreme Court. And the statutory question and the non-delegation question and maybe the takings clause question are all merits issues that I think will get decided in some way.
Yeah, I think I love the takings. I mean, I love the takings clause issue, but I love the takings issue because I do not understand how you make a case in this day and age and in COVID that if you seized land, if you seized housing, if you seized some type of building or land from the state to answer for the eviction moratorium and to put in place affordable housing, I do not see how you would have a challenge in for public use. It just is. It seems duh. It's just that they're not going to do it for political reasons. Richard, you had a related question to Genevieve, so I left you on the screen, but nice to see you. Oh wait, I can't. Oh, there you go.
Can you see? Can you hear me? Can I see me? Yes. Okay. So I'm wondering if you can help me understand what the relationship is between the authority of the president and that of an agency within the executive branch. And I mean this at even a more general level than what we're dealing with here with the CDC, relationship with the CDC to the president. And just in general, how circumcised, historically has an agency's authority been seen to be, and is there any sense in which they might act on behalf of the president?
Well, I would start by saying there are two kinds of agencies. Some are unambiguously in the executive branch, and some are more quasi-independent and a little bit insulated from the command structure of the executive branch. Whichever type we're talking about, it's governed by an organic statute, the law that gives it its job. And so the president can't, tell the CDC to go into some other field of endeavor. Its job is public health under its organic statute. But within the terms of the statute and within the structure of appointments, the command authority, policy initiatives, priorities are shaped from above. And the leadership is politically appointed, within an administration. So, there is significant executive control.
So an agency can't just do it what it wants and say, we're carrying out what the president wants to do. And I guess that's not really what I'm
not out beyond its organic statute and or some other constitutional winner of an argument that you have authority to do that.
And not beyond the president's own toleration of what the agency head might be contemplating. And so, you get to do that until the point at which you are removed by the president or directed by the president to do otherwise.
Right. This is a case where, we know in the month since the Supreme Court declined to vacate the stay that, the Biden administration thought everything was cool because COVID was receding, and then realized we were back in trouble, and at the last minute sought legislation, and that couldn't happen, and then thought and really kind of lawyered in press conferences too much, thought or described the Supreme Court as having decided something that precluded a new moratorium. And then Dr. Walensky issued a new and slightly restricted moratorium.
So I have a quick question, just before I bring in the next round of people. What do you give the over-under on how long you think this moratorium is going to keep being keep going. So like, obviously it goes to October 1 now, right? That was the new date, right?
October 3.
October 3, right, okay. October 3, do you think it'll be renewed again? Actually, it's a good poll question.
Right.
I will see what people think.
Well, isn't there an antecedent question of whether the Supreme Court or the courts collectively will tolerate it that long?
Right.
Till October 3rd? I think that they will. But what do you think?
Judge Friedrich had a hearing today, and she said that there's been an element of gamesmanship, that was her word, in the Biden administration's course here, and that she'll issue a decision in the near future. I think she is bound by the circuit panel decision, but then, going above her, back to the circuit, trying to expedite an appeal in the circuit, trying to get some kind of stay in the Supreme Court, that will all accelerate, and probably before October 3rd.
I do want to say that there is a pretty fierce defense of the Biden administration on the law in Lawfare today by Jack Goldsmith, whom you might not expect to take this view. But his view is that as a legal matter, as opposed to an optics matter, the case is very simple. Dabney Friedrich issued an order. The D.C. Circuit reversed it. The Supreme Court did not, whatever Brett Kavanaugh may say in a sole concurrence, they did not lift the stay or interfere with the D.C. Circuit's order. Therefore, the Biden administration is entitled to rely on the D.C. Circuit as the governing order of the case. Full stop, no buts, no exceptions. The rest is all optics. And then he goes on to criticize the Biden administration's handling of the optics. But as a legal matter, he regards it as not merely a question on which people are getting it wrong, but an easy question, i.e. the administration is fully within its rights to do what it did.
On the statute. And I agree with that. Yeah. And Larry Tribe had a Boston Globe op-ed piece that says, a lot of that too. I think that's right. But the non-delegation issue, the takings issue, there are things that Judge Friedrich didn't reach, and another case might reach it.
I think that that all of this has been there for this entire time, and we were also panicked dealing with COVID, that it's just I think that people are just getting it together. I do not think that kind of speed bodes well for how this is going to play out or how quickly that money gets released or anything else. I just think that we're a little, everyone, rightly, is a little bit behind the ball because there were other fires that had to be put out before we kind of dealt with some of the non-delegation issues around eviction moratoria.
Fires.
But we have here Justices Tomei and with pants to resolve the question for us.
I know. It's true. I want Paula to read her state her question, the first question that you asked, Paula, and then I want EG to read his question because I think that they're I thought that they were really nice next to each other. So just gonna put that out there. I'm curating. Hold on, I'm gonna unmute you. There you go.
Okay, so my first question is, what is the role of intuition, morality, and intention when examining the permissibility of the eviction moratorium and the action of the president, especially considering we're concerned with executive overreach?
And EG, what was your question?
So, am I a chump for having been paying my rent for the past year and a half during the pandemic?
Yeah. Okay, thank you both for being good sports. I'll restate Paula's excellent question, just so that we have it. So what is the role of intuition, morality, and intention? When examining the legality and permissibility of the eviction moratorium and the actions of presidents, especially now that we are so concerned with executive power overreach. I would say, one, we've always been concerned with executive power overreach, in particular the last 4 or 5 years, but before that, and I think that anyone any type of law professor worth their salt would have to tell you that the role of intuition, morality, and intention should have everything to do with examining the legality and permissibility of an eviction. Maybe that's just my critical legal studies speaking. But what do you think, John?
No, I'm with you. I think, in the end, judges are result pickers, drawing on different methodologies and ideas of their jobs, but they're choosing a bottom line. And I think the intentions and assessments and motivations all go into that. The DOJ brief, this last brief filed to Judge Friedrich, is all about, holy cow, COVID is a disaster again. We're not proceeding in bad faith. We're not making stuff up. CDC is dealing with a Delta crisis here. And there are 400,000 cases of evicted people who got COVID that the statistics indicate would have been prevented by an eviction moratorium. I take that at face value, and it's very serious. And I think it matters to anybody who's trying to decide, is this just screw the landlords? Is this just socializing housing? Is this letting everybody be a chump? Or is this public health?
But can I say that, the crits and the non-originalist, textualist types can take this point too far sometimes. Mm-hmm. And if you write the legal opinion that says, I'm going to defer to CDC on this and let this moratorium stand because I have a moral intuition that we're way less well off without a moratorium than with one. And that's that's based on some combination of my, personal experience, religious worldview, personal morality. There's very little reason for anybody who doesn't share those qualities with you to take your ruling seriously as a judge. At some point, while
even
I agree,
if they do, honestly.
I'm sorry?
You can agree and still overturn someone if it doesn't.
No. My point is, if you simply wear it on your sleeve and
right.
say, hey, this is my moral intuition, so I'm going to use my authority as a judge to force it down your throat, the proper response to that is disrespect. And similarly, I don't think anybody here would argue, so what you should really do is hide the ball, operate on the basis of your moral intuition, but just couch it in a lot of good language, right? So, a good judge is actually principled. Now, the where the question gets hard is if you take good, serious legal minds who are genuinely principled, but who have different moral and, I forget the way Paula framed the question, intuitions about certain questions, they're not always going to get the same answer because those intuitions actually do affect the way they think about certain questions. And I think what Kate and John are both saying is that is inevitable and that it's nothing to run away from. But I wouldn't want you to take from that therefore principle doesn't exist, or therefore
that's a wonderful point. No,
that there's no
that law doesn't matter.
There's no such
or
thing
that there
as
is
a
no
neutral
law.
principle.
No, I'm not saying that at all.
No, I don't think
No.
either of us would say that. But no, not at all. It's just that, at the end of the day, when it comes to defining some of these things, we are creatures of construct and culture and our own, and the times we live in, and that and for everything from definitional kind of decisions to things that are going to be more normatively or prescriptively outcome driven. But yes,
or even just let me give another example an example, very tangible one that we've talked about on this show before. So in the case that I forget the name of the case. I'm bad with captions. The application of Title VII to trans and sexual orientation.
Bostock.
Bostock, thank you. I think it's reasonable to say that if this same question had presented to somebody who believes the things that Neil Gorsuch believes jurisprudentially 25 years ago, it would have been laughed at.
Yes.
And the difference
Just
is,
like Lawrence v. Texas was laughed at before 2005.
although Lawrence v. Texas, had, Bowers had 4 votes for it. So, I mean,
Well,
but
just like Loving versus Virginia was
Yes,
laughed at in the
right. I mean,
1950s.
What do you mean? Like what we? Yeah. Thank
and
you.
it's not
Thank
that
you,
the
John. Perfect.
law changed. It's that Gorsuch's sense of what's laughable changed.
Yeah, the norms
And-
around it changed.
And that's a good example of just intuition. Like does the because of sex in Title VII cover, transgender discrimination? If you'd asked a Neil Gorsuch-like thinker in 1975 that question, I think he would have giggled, because the idea that trans rights was something that we needed to think about just hadn't penetrated the culture yet. Now it does, and so we think about that same statutory language differently. And I think that, and even an originalist textualist like Gorsuch thinks about that statutory language differently. And so that's, I think, a pretty pristine example of something that where the moral intuition is affecting even the people who deny that it has any place in consideration.
I just want to say, this is just a funny story. My parents both went to kind of like run-of-the-mill, kind of just go to like lower, like they paid for their own law school, and so they went to like where they got scholarships, and grew up kind of just learning New York State law, always doing New York State law. And then my parents obviously both became judges, that we talked about before. I came home from Georgetown after my first semester, and I told them about critical legal studies, and my parents were like, "What are you learning?" And we're not helping you with tuition anymore.
And they started, and that's how it all ended up on Fox News.
Yeah, and they're just like, oh my God.
Judge Klonick picked up the phone and called Sean Hannity and said, "Look what my daughter's being taught in law school."
It wasn't that. It was that my mom was, and both of them were just emphatic, and I don't know how else to put this, that they followed the law, that they just followed the law, that was it was not, they were not inserting their opinions or the changing norms of society. And what happens in law school is you focus on all these huge big picture Supreme Court cases that are being reflective and are policy kind of directives in their own right. And then the run-of-the-mill cases in general courts of general jurisdiction, most of the cases are not hard cases, and most of them you can just follow the law, and it just tells you exactly, even sometimes if it's a little sad or or whatever else, you just follow the law. So anyway, sorry, that was just kind of my
well,
two
and
cents.
even back to this one, it in the end, we've got a section of this Public Health Service Act which judges will read, and Judge Friedrich comes out in one place, the DC Circuit may come out in another place, the Sixth Circuit is going to be, in the end, the Supreme Court is going to be where they are. In the background will be attitudes, experiences, the point in time we're at, the kind of worldview of good faith and COVID and so forth. But text, the actual materials, the wording, the proper construct of the two clauses, that's judicial work. And I think that that's where this will end up.
Yeah, I completely agree. Paula has another question, and then we're going to end. Paula, what is your second question?
So I think this is maybe more to your point on the downstream effects on the markets and the landlords themselves. And maybe I'm dropping the ball by asking the question here. I would assume that unemployment would having or receiving unemployment should be used for rent, right? I mean, that would be my assumption, or that I think you said that there was relief for those who were landlords, why there is no change in the onus or the responsibility instead of giving those paychecks to renters to make that payment themselves. Because I mean, I don't know if that's a naive assumption to assume that the unemployment checks should be used for that, and that the people who are supposedly supposed to be having trouble with paying their rent are the ones also receiving unemployment checks. And that's what you would assume that money would be going towards. I don't know if I'm making really naive assumptions.
No, it's a great question. Unemployment insurance is wage replacement, not dollar for dollar, but a sufficient percentage to allow you to continue the necessities of your life, which is food and shelter. So you're really asking a kind of double dipping question, I think. Is the renter relief, in addition to unemployment insurance, in effect a windfall that is doubly benefiting people above what they need? And I don't know the stats to assess that, but that's an interesting question.
Or, I mean, even switching the onus, like, am I wrong that you said that the renters relief checks were going to the landlords themselves, not the renters?
No, they're supposed to go to the tenants to pay their rent.
Okay.
The tenants are supposed to apply for the compensation.
Economically speaking, Paula, like one of the big arguments I would say in economics, and there's a great book on this by Annie Lowry, that is called Give Them Money, I think is like the name of it, but is basically an argument for the reason there are food stamps is that you want people to just spend their money on food stamps and not take that money and spend it on drugs and so there's a certain amount of paternalism, a lot of paternalism in trying to basically give government handouts for specific things. One of the reasons that the economic stimulus checks were so controversial, but also so kind of think that people who are strict kind of capitalists would think that they were just not having any type of how you spent that money. You don't have to go spend it on rent. You can spend it on TV instead of spending it on rent. All stimulated the economy, all created this type of a generation of generated wealth in different capacities. And that would all trickle down in some way. We're kind of seeing that maybe people didn't pay their rent, which brings us back to E.G. Phillips' question, which is, of course you pay your rent because otherwise you're a jerk. That's just, and you don't want that shit on your I'm gonna say your credit will be toast if you just stop paying rent. It might take a while, but life is long.
You'll be ducks without pants before you know it.
Yeah, you'll be ducks. They'll take your pants, E.G. So
ducks with repossessed
yes.
pants.
Bye, Paula.
We are gonna leave it there.
John,
you.
I love hanging out with you always. My
You're
John
a great
was
American.
We
didn't. This is the first time we've ever talked that neither the Independent Counsel Law nor Justice Jackson
there were lots of questions about
nor Inspector General have come up.
There'll be other times, but I know a few other things. I'm interested in a few other things.
It's just what we talk about. I mean,
that's true.
I think that there's. This was great. I've been wanting to talk about this for a while, so thank you for coming on and doing
thanks
all
for
that
asking
research.
me.
Thank you.
And thanks, Genevieve, for arranging it. This was perfect.
Yep. Thanks, Genevieve. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
We
will
be
back. Sorry, go ahead, Kate.
No, we've done this twice today, Ben. We've said the exact same thing at
They're
the
in
exact
sync.
same time. It's never happened before. We're finally mind melding. See, we just did it again. Anyway, we will be back 23 hours exactly from now with the treasurer of Rhode Island, Seth Magaziner, to join us in talking about his suit against Facebook on behalf of the citizens of pensioners of Rhode Island. And Cambridge, following the Cambridge Analytica settlement, and whether or not that was in state shareholders' best interests. And until then, Ben,
we don't have fun anymore, but we have polka dots, and at least for now, and whichever comes first, Dabney Friedrich's ruling or October 3rd, we have cost-free possessions of our rental properties if we want to destroy our credit ratings. So, you decide.
Or someday be without pants.
Yeah.
So, yeah.